When soloing, you need to be aware of the chord tones you're playing over. This in part determines your note selection and how to use the tones in your chosen scale that aren't voiced in the chord. Some notes in the scale won't be part of the chord you're playing over. These are known as non-chord tones. You can still use them, they just have a different function to the natural chord tones in the scale. This lesson is all about identifying and using these non-chord tones in your solos. Fortunately, music has built-in rules we can follow to ensure we don't unintentionally wander from harmony into dissonance. When I say rules, I don't mean the universe will implode if you ignore them. And there are always exceptions to these rules, since music is ultimately subjective. But they are useful guides to help keep our music sounding musical. The general rule is that non-chord tones tend to occur 1/2 step up from a chord tone. Let's say we're soloing over a major chord. The major chord consists of the intervals of a major third and perfect fifth above the root. So these are the chord tones we'll be playing over and harmonizing. If we look at the entire sequence of intervals from the chromatic scale, that is the 12 notes of the guitar, we can pull out the major triad as follows. From this, we can see which intervals fall within the half-step rule in relation to the major chord intervals. Specifically, the non-chord tones over a major chord are the minor second, which is a half step from the root, the fourth, which is a half step from the major third, and the minor sixth, which is a half step from the fifth. Emphasizing any of these tones over a major chord will create dissonance. But these three tones, the minor second, fourth, and minor sixth, occur naturally in scales that are played over major chords. So how should we use them, if at all? Take the major scale, the most commonly referenced scale in Western music. We can see that the fourth occurs in this scale. We now know from the half-step rule the fourth is a non-chord tone in relation to major chords, because it lies a half step above the major third chord tone. If we end a phrase on the fourth over a major chord, we can hear a certain degree of unresolved dissonance. But if we instead resolve that fourth to a chord tone, such as the major third, it blends into the phrase more naturally and musically. We can also glance over it by using it in a hammer-on, pull-off situation. In fact, the fourth serves a useful function in major key harmony in terms of aiding resolution. It tends to pull to the major third. But we can also lead it up to the fifth, another safe chord tone over major chords. So the key thing here is not to use the fourth as a target note over major chords that share the same root as the scale, also known as the tonic chord. When the chord changes, the fourth may take on a more harmonic function, but your understanding of this will come when you learn to solo over chord changes. Let's take another example. Here's the Phrygian dominant scale, known for its hauntingly tense quality. We can see that the major triad occurs in this scale, so it'll work over major chords. But we can also see that the minor second, fourth, and minor sixth non-chord tones are present in the scale. So we have 3 non-chord tones to negotiate when using this scale. The fourth will function in exactly the same way it did when using the major scale. Holding the minor second over the major chord will sound harsh and dissonant. But remember, it's not an avoid note as such. You just need to be aware of what it will add to the expression you're trying to create in your solo. If you want that harsh, dissonant sound, try ending a phrase on the minor second. But if you want resolution, you'll want to pull it back to the root or lead it to the major third. These are the options you need to explore as a creative musician. So when learning scale patterns, you need to be aware of not only where to put your fingers, but also where each tone lies. The minor sixth of the scale will be used in a similar way as other non-chord tones, resolving either to the fifth or the minor seventh. The same general rule applies to minor scales over minor chords of the same root. The minor chord tones are root, minor third, and fifth. So we can see the non-chord tones over a minor chord would be the minor second, major third, and minor sixth. As the major third doesn't appear in minor scales, we can disregard that one. Unlike with major chords, the fourth can be held quite comfortably over minor chords because it's one whole step up from the minor third, avoiding the half step rule. Why does this make a difference to the human ear? To answer that, we need to delve into the physics behind pitch relationships. We don't have time for that right now, unfortunately, but you can find interesting discussions on this in music theory forums. Take the natural minor scale. There we have a non-chord tone in the form of a minor sixth. Again, you can hear its dissonance if we target that note in a phrase. So, like before, if we want to use it musically, we should perhaps resolve it to a more stable tone in the scale, such as the fifth. The main thing to remember is not to use the minor sixth as a landing note over that tonic minor chord. Now, as mentioned before, there are exceptions to this half-step rule. One of those exceptions is if a chord tone happens to be a half step up from another chord tone. An example of this would be the root in a major seventh chord. Even though the root appears a half step above the major seventh, it can't be considered a non-chord tone because the root is itself a chord tone, and arguably the most important chord tone of all. In this lesson, we've been looking at non-chord tones that exist within common scales, but there are also non-chord tones that exist not only outside a chord's natural tones, but also as scales. So they are completely outside the natural harmony of a given chord and scale. The use of these outside tones is known as chromaticism. We'll look more at how we can introduce chromatic tones into our solos in a following part. Cheers.